Hitler's last big idea in Normandy wasn't subtle. It was a blunt force lunge, straight at the narrow strip of roads around Avranches, because that corridor was the only thing keeping Patton's breakout connected to the rest of the Allied front. Slam it shut, and you don't just slow the Americans down. You trap them. And on paper, the order sounds almost logical. Germany still has experienced armored divisions in France. The Americans are stretched. The front is messy. So if you hit hard, fast, and at the right spot, maybe you can rewind the calendar back to before the breakout. But here's the part that always gets glossed over. This counterattack wasn't just fighting American infantry and tanks. It was stepping into a battlefield where the Allies had built something new, a pipeline from a soldier with a radio to rockets falling out of clouds. And once that pipeline locks onto you, the battle stops being about bravery. It becomes about whether you can even move. Mortain sits in the Norman bocage, tight roads, hedgerows like walls, little villages that force armor into narrow funnels. In early August 1944, those funnels mattered more than ever because the German front had started a tear. The American breakout, what historians usually connect Operation Cobra, had punched through, and now U.S. columns were pouring south and west. Avranches was the hinge point. Lose it, and the breakout becomes a flood. Cut it, and the flood might get bottled up long enough for Germany to breathe again. That's why the German plan centered on a simple, brutal concept. Drive toward Avranches, cut the corridor, and force the Allies into a scramble. No elegant encirclement. No slow preparation. Just armor moving fast, with everyone pretending speed could substitute for air cover. The gamble, though, had a timer on it. German commanders knew what daylight meant in Normandy by August. If you moved in mass, you got spotted. If you got spotted, you got hit. And if you got hit, the attack didn't just lose vehicles. It lost tempo, the one thing an armored thrust can't survive without. Still, the order comes down anyway. Operation Lüttich. The very name sounds like confidence, like there's still a playbook full of options. But the situation behind the name was ugly. Fuel was tight. Units were under strength. Radios and coordination were a constant headache. And Allied fighters had been chewing up the Luftwaffe for months, which meant the Germans were going to attempt a major armored counterattack with little ability to protect it from above. What makes it even more tense is that the Allies weren't blind. Ultra, signals intelligence from decrypted German communications, had been warning that a counterstroke was coming. That didn't mean every unit on the line was perfectly positioned, because war doesn't work like that. But it meant higher headquarters had reason to expect something nasty near Mortain. Hensley, Blumenson. So both sides step into the morning with a strange mix of confidence and dread. The Germans believe they're about to restore the situation with one hard punch. The Americans know a punch is coming, but they're thin, tired, and spread. And then the attack begins. The first hours are the most dangerous ones, because this is when the story can still go either way. In the early light, German armor pushes out of the Mortain area and slams into American positions. In places, U.S. units are forced back, not because they're weak, but because tanks coming through hedgerow country have a nasty way of appearing where you don't want them. You can be doing everything right and still get rolled up by a spearhead that finds a seam. For a moment, it feels like the nightmare scenario. The corridor to Avranches looks less like a secure highway and more like a door that's halfway shut, with a heavy boot pushing against it. But then the battle reveals its anchor point, Hill 314. It's not a huge mountain. It's a piece of high ground overlooking the area. And in bocage country, that's like owning a camera tower in the middle of a maze. An American battalion-sized force ends up isolated there, cut off, surrounded, and hanging on under pressure for days. That defense becomes one of those stories that sounds exaggerated until you read how often they called in artillery, how they reported German movements, and how much their position mattered to the fight below. And while Hill 314 is fighting for his life, the weather starts to shift. This is the moment that turns Lüttich from dangerous into doomed, because the German attack needed one big thing: time under cover. Haze, cloud, rain, anything that makes aircraft hesitant and target spotting harder. Some accounts emphasize that the Germans got a brief window early on, helped by conditions that limited air intervention at first. But Normandy weather doesn't negotiate. When it clears, it clears. And once it clears, you're no longer just fighting the enemy in front of you. You're fighting a schedule. The Allied air effort in Normandy wasn't improvised. By 1944, both the RAF and the U.S. had developed ways to feed aircraft into a battlefield quickly. Controllers, radios, procedures, and pre-planned readiness, so strikes could be called in with speed that would have sounded impossible a few years earlier. The British and Americans didn't always do it the same way, and it wasn't perfect, but the direction was clear. Air power wasn't nearby. It was integrated. So when German columns are spotted, it isn't one lucky squadron wandering overhead. It becomes a rotation. Aircraft cycling in and out. Attacks stacking on the same roads. Strafing, rockets, bombs. Whatever the aircraft are carrying, applied again and again until the movement stops or the vehicles disperse. And that dispersal is its own trap in bocage country. Because the hedgerows that hide you also restrict you. Tanks can't just glide off into open fields like they're on parade ground. Trucks can't teleport to safety. So the very terrain that makes infantry fighting a nightmare can also make a column feel like it's stuck inside a set of narrow hallways. Hallways the enemy can see from above. Now here's where the story gets spicy, because this is the part people argue about. If you've heard the popular version, you've heard that Typhoons and Thunderbolts simply wiped German armor off the map. Rockets screaming in, Panthers exploding, the whole counterattack shattered by air power alone. But when historians dug into post-battle evidence, wreck inspections, unit records, the kind of unglamorous accounting that doesn't make it into dramatic retellings, the picture got more complicated. Pilots often believed they destroyed more tanks than they actually had. Smoke, dust, multiple attacks on the same target, and vehicles left burning for different reasons, all inflated claims. That doesn't mean pilots lied. It means battle is confusing at 400 miles an hour. So if air power didn't magically delete every German tank, what did it really do? It did something that's arguably worse. It made the attack impossible to coordinate. Because tanks aren't independent creatures. A tank division doesn't run on steel and courage. It runs on fuel trucks, ammunition carriers, recovery vehicles, engineers, radios, and a constant flow of supplies. When air attacks shred that soft underbelly, especially in daylight, armor turns into isolated metal without reach. And once you lose tempo, you lose options. That's what starts happening around Mortain. Movement slows. Units stop to reform. Columns bunch up on the few usable roads. And every time they bunch up, they create the exact kind of target aircraft love. Long lines of vehicles that can't scatter fast enough. The psychological effect matters too. Even when rockets miss, the near-miss shock, the blast, the noise, the sudden fire, the sense of being hunted from above, it forces crews to choose survival over speed. A commander can order advance, but he can't order everyone to stop flinching when the next pass comes in. Meanwhile, down on the ground, the Americans aren't just waiting to be rescued by aircraft. Artillery is doing what artillery does in Normandy, turning known routes into punished zones. Tank destroyers and anti-tank guns wait on likely approaches. Infantry fights from hedgerows and villages, where a tank's advantages shrink and the fight becomes close and brutal. That combination, air pressure plus ground resistance, creates a nasty feedback loop for the Germans. Every pause to deal with a roadblock or a knocked-out vehicle increases exposure to air attack. Every air attack forces dispersal and delay, which give the ground defenders time to reposition and reinforce. And while that's happening, the higher-level command problem becomes impossible to ignore. German commanders are being pushed by rigid expectations from above. The whole point of Lüttich is speed. But the battlefield is screaming that speed is dying. This is where the human drama gets almost painful, because you can imagine what it feels like to be inside an armored headquarters that understands the math. You know you can't win a daytime race under sky the enemy owns. You know every hour that passes bleeds fuel and vehicles. You know that even if you reach your objective, you might not be able to hold it because the follow-on support won't arrive intact. But you're still being told to push. So the push continues in fragments. Local thrusts, attempt to bypass strong points, repeated efforts to pry open a road network like a jammed door. And each attempt runs into the same wall. limited routes, stubborn defense, and aircraft returning again and again. Up on Hill 314, the isolated American defenders become a symbol of the whole fight. Their position helps spot movement. Their resistance forces Germans to commit effort to reduce a strong point they can't ignore. And the longer they hold, the more the German attack bleeds time. Time it doesn't have. This is one of those battlefield moments where a small force doesn't just hold out. It changes the shape of the battle. Because if you're trying to cut a corridor, you can't tolerate an enemy observation post watching your routes. You can't tolerate artillery calls falling on your assembly areas. And you can't tolerate a pocket of resistance that keeps reporting what you're doing. So the Germans keep trying to crush it, and the Americans keep refusing to disappear. By the end of the first day, the dream of a clean breakthrough is already fading. Even where German armor has advanced, it's not flowing, it's pulsing. Forward, stop, regroup, forward again, like a runner who keeps getting shoved back onto the starting line. And now the larger consequences start to show, because the Mortain counterattack isn't happening in a vacuum. While German armor is tied up trying to reach Avranches, the Allied operational machine is still moving. Patton's forces are still pushing, and Allied commanders are still looking for ways to turn the German situation into a trap rather than just a retreat. This is where Mortain becomes more than a battle. It becomes a misallocation of the last German mobility. A failed counterattack doesn't just fail. It also spends fuel, burns vehicles, and, most importantly, fixes units in place. And if your units are fixed in place while the enemy is maneuvering, you're not defending. You're waiting to be surrounded. That's the road that leads toward the Falaise pocket, where German forces, already battered and low on mobility, end up compressed into a shrinking escape route under constant Allied pressure. Air attacks have become infamous too. And again, historians argue about the exact ratio of destruction from air versus artillery and ground fire. But consensus on the bigger point is hard to dodge. Once Germany lost the ability to move safely in daylight, its withdrawals became catastrophes in slow motion. So what actually destroyed Lüttich? If you're looking for one magic weapon, you'll miss the lesson. It was a system. It was Allied airfields pushed forward as the front advanced. It was fuel and spares that kept aircraft flying. It was trained pilots and replacement pipelines. It was radios, controllers, and procedures that turned sightings into strikes. It was an industrial base that made losses survivable for the Allies and unbearable for Germany. That last part is the most uncomfortable because it makes individual heroism feel smaller. In 1944, the United States produced aircraft at a staggering rate, on the order of tens of thousands in a single year, while Britain also produced enormous numbers in Germany, fighting on multiple fronts under bombing and resource strain, could not match the combined Allied capacity in the long run. Exact totals vary by how historians count types and categories, but the overall imbalance is not really disputed. So when people describe Mortain as the day the Typhoon stopped the Panzers, they're pointing at something real, but not the whole truth. The aircraft mattered. But what mattered even more was that the aircraft were only the visible part of a deeper advantage. The Allies could create pressure all day, over and over, and still be ready to do it again tomorrow. Germany couldn't. And once you understand that, the Mortain story lands differently. It stops being a tale about one failed counterattack and turns into a warning about modern war. If your enemy owns the air, your tanks don't become less effective. They become prisoners of the clock. Because every movement has to be at night. Every supply run is a gamble, and every delay multiplies into a larger failure. The Germans didn't lose at Mortain because their crews forgot how to fight. They lost because the conditions of fighting had changed, and the change wasn't tactical, it was structural. The Allies could coordinate faster, replace faster, and sustain pressure longer. When the counterattack finally sputtered out, the map didn't just stay the same. The German position got worse. The failure helped confirm what many German commanders already feared. Normandy wasn't going to be stabilized. It was going to break open wider, and once it did, retreat would turn into collapse. And that's the thought that should stick with you. Not who had the best tank. Not who fired the best rocket. But this: if you can't move in daylight without getting hit within minutes, can you really call yourself an armored force anymore?